benefit my online students as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk Beowulf. Let me get to the slideshow. Okay, so first things first, a little bit of history. As I've mentioned in this class before, English majors are at least history minors, or do a lot of study of history on their own, because a lot of times in order to understand literature, we have to understand the background of the culture that came from. So just a little bit of background on great. Most of you, I assume, are familiar with the Arthurian legends, at least somewhat. Nothing else from Disney's Sword in the Stone or other things like that. And Arthur was a Briton. He was not an Anglo-Saxon like Beowulf is. Because Britain, after the fall of the Roman Empire, really went through a long period of transition over the first millennium. But this reads, abandoned as the Romans' client state, the island's factional territories lay open to Germanic invasion and Viking coastal raids, especially Viking coastal raids to the northeast in Northumbria, those areas of England. Until utterly conquered by the Normans, whose culture was a blend of Nordic aggression and French Christianity. Traditions of canonical and heretical Christianity were well established on the island when the Beowulf narrative became part of the Anglo-Saxon cultural currency. Grammatically similar to Latin, Old English was preserved in spoken form by Britons on the fringes of the realm when the Anglo-Saxon was overwritten by William the Conqueror. The Anglo-Saxons chronicle records many details of raids, sieges, and conquests. Okay, so this is a language issue. This is one of the first works that we have in Old English, which is a very Germanic language. The Norman French influence is really what gave us the language that we have today. And really, for about 500 years, the noblemen in England spoke French. They spoke Norman French, whereas the common people spoke English. That's why we have so many terms where there's more than one word for the same thing. You know, it's a cow in the field. It's beef on the plate, because the French word for cow is boeuf. So the French word is the more sophisticated word, or the euphemism, more often than not, whereas the Old English root comes from the Germanic tribes. But when this story, and the historical Beowulf would have lived around 100 AD, but this was a story, a cultural story that was kind of incorporated into and what I mean by that is this is something similar to, well, there's a movie coming out this year, I think, with Beauty and the Beast, you know, of European folk tales that don't necessarily originate in English, but it is a story that has been incorporated into our culture. And Beowulf's kind of similar. Although these actions take place on the continent, there's a cultural connection between England and the Angles and Saxons on the continent. Okay, so a little bit more background. And this is on the manuscript itself. Date this manuscript to around the year 1000, which would have been just before the Norman conquest in 1066. The person who's writing this from an original copy that's now lost is a Christian, whereas Beowulf certainly was not. During the time of Beowulf, Germanic tribes were, it was kind of their hobby to slaughter Christian missionaries in a variety of different ways. As it says here, the story of Beowulf is much older, determined by the vocabulary choice and genealogical allusions. In other words, they can say, okay, this word that's in the original manuscript was not used past X years, so that's how they can date a manuscript. The poem appears to be set in the 6th century. Hygelac, who is a relative of Beowulf and a king of the Geats, died around 520. So if he died around 520, and that's when Beowulf became king, that puts Beowulf's date of birth 480, 490 in the Common Era, somewhere in there. It would have been considered the remote past even by 11th century readers. 600 years in the past, even for the people reading this manuscript. The subject matter is not English. Beowulf is a member of the Geats, who lived in the south of what is now Sweden, and he goes to serve Hrothgar, the king of the Danes. During this time, England was only beginning to be settled by Germanic tribes, which had invaded the island around 450. And this is really of Arthurian legends, which we'll get to next with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Arthur may have been a Roman nobleman that was left over, but regardless of who he was, the Arthurian legends are the Britons lived in Great Britain during the time of Roman rule, trying to kick out the Angles and the Saxons, what this story is about. And we actually still have remnants of those original British people. The Germanic tribes drove them to the western part of the island, which is now, and Welsh is the descendants of that original British language. But also some went across the English Channel to Brittany, land of the Britons in northern France. And actually William the Conqueror, at the Battle of Hastings, in which the Normans conquered, his left flank was completely made up of Britons who were essentially coming back to take their island again several hundred years later. Now, of course, they were French and more Viking than anything else by that time. But certainly, I think it's interesting that they were kicked out of Britain in 600, 400 years later. They come back to help conquer the island. Okay. So the Geats, who are the people, because we certainly don't have a Geat land anymore, that this story is about. Beowulf takes on a variety of roles within the tribal social system. And in fact, the word for tribe in German is Deutsch. Deutschland is the tribal land. That's what it literally means. There's a tribal nature to Germanic peoples that's at the root of their very culture. Begins among the Geats as a strong fighter of marginal status as nephew to the king. He is adopted with great honor into Hrothgar's household and later becomes ruler of the Geats when Hygelac dies without a male heir. Some females that are just kind of mentioned offhand, but for the most part, the only women that are mentioned in this text are queens, and of course, Grendel's mother, who doesn't really count. The relationship of the king and the warrior is reciprocal, as the warrior provides service while his lord offers protection and distributes wealth, often in the form of armbands or neck torques, which are rings. And that's in the book, when you see it, his reward is described as rings. Oftentimes there would be rings that go around the arm, kind of choker type necklaces that are made of precious stones. Hererot, a great hall, becomes a place of communal gathering and feasting, of goodwill and social bonds, where oaths of loyalty are sworn, golden rings are distributed, and deeds and genealogies are sung. This is you've probably seen the Viking longhouse, which is practical in places that have extreme winters. And the farther north you go, really the farther underground these. And we have English words that relate to this as well. If you have a house whose roof is made of grass, and that's the only part of the house that's sticking up, you let your horses and cattle graze on that grass. Well, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear a horse on top of the house, you have a nightmare being a horse. That's where we get that term from. That's the origin of that term. Okay. As Beowulf prepares for battle with Grendel's mother, Unferth lends him a rare and ancient sword. And remember, Unferth is very critical of Beowulf initially because he's trying to prove the point, or trying to prove his worth or prove his valor, which I think is legitimate. None of these people know Beowulf. So if Unferth had heard something that he is a liar or a braggart, considering Beowulf is trying to save them from a monster, it's kind of appropriate to vet this type of person. Yes, a rare and ancient sword, and he leaves his own weapon with the Dane. Beowulf discovers an ancient blade with rune markings in the place he kills Grendel's mother, a sword from the days of giants. Might be an allusion even to Greek mythology of the time of the Titans, which would have been Zeus's parents, Chaos and others. These swords is described as an heirloom, or a lade lafa, the old thing that is left. The weapon is thus an instrument of warfare and a symbol of community, continuity. One thing that really defines this culture of these Germanic tribes is violence. So instruments of violence, swords, armor, nature become heirlooms, and very important, both symbolically and in actuality, for these characters that we're going to be looking at. Okay, and this is a bit of a reminder, but like the Iliad, like Gilgamesh, this is an epic poem. And when you refer to this, say when you're writing or something like that, you wouldn't refer to it as a story, you would refer to it as a poem, because it is in poem form. And we're actually in class going to look at or listen to someone reading from said poem. But I digress again. Elements of epic writing. Generally, these are longer stories. Historic or mythical. Notice that we have elements of the mythic that have kind of been infused with Christianity. Were Grendel and his mother in the original story descendants of Cain? I doubt it. But the Christian scribe is inserting Christianity into the work. But still, they are mythical type creatures. Motifs. These are common themes that appear over and over again. Things like violence, things like the importance of familial bonds, valor, doing what's right for the community, divine intervention. And it's a little complicated in Beowulf because we have a pagan text that is being copied and altered by a Christian. So in essence, we have the scribe writing Beowulf as if he's a Christian, and just doesn't know it. That's kind of the way that this work goes. A heroic flaw. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be something bad, like we had with Oedipus, where the hubris or the human confidence becomes a tragic flaw, or even something like Achilles' arrogance or his rage becomes a bit of a tragic flaw. Heroes, in order to be human, even if they're part god like Gilgamesh, often have some sort of flaw. Beowulf, finished it yet, but his dedication to duty, even when it's going to end up poorly, can be a flaw. He doesn't have a second thought about going after Grendel's mother. He knows that the Danes are in trouble with Grendel. Now, but he also has another reason for going in and helping out with Grendel. Does anybody remember what that reason was? Why does he feel like he needs to go help Hrothgar, the king of the Danes? What did Hrothgar do for Beowulf's family? Exactly. Yes, Beowulf's dad was separated from the Geats. Hrothgar took him in and was kind to him, and to repay that kindness, Beowulf feels like he needs to help out with Grendel. Orality and performance in the writing. Now, the language that's used in this piece, there's actually a specific meter that translator here does a pretty good job of keeping the flavor, but also keeping the same meaning. This was used, and we're going to see this with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The form was used here as alliterative verse. In other words, where for us, usually if you're going to repeat something in a poem, it's rhyme, or you're going to have something that's consistent throughout. It's either rhyme, meter, or both. Whereas for the Old English and Middle English too, it was alliterative verse. In other words, words starting with the same, and there would be a break, and we'll see this later in class today. There'll be a break in the middle of the line where you would have two sets of alliteration, and you can really hear it when I'm gonna play a short little section of somebody reading from the original text, which I really enjoy sharing because I often have students complain when we get to Shakespeare, well, I can't read it in Old English. No, it's in modern English. It's in early modern English, but Shakespeare's in modern English because Old English is quite different. Okay. Some of the stuff that I talked about with the alliterative verse. There's no fixed length to the lines. Again, the importance is on the alliteration. The caesura is that space in the middle that I was talking about. And because I'm tired this morning, I couldn't think of the word, so I tried to keep talking until it came out. Some of you might be teachers, so I'm trying to give you some tips on how to try and stall until something comes to you. The scup, or the breath pauses, these are places where, again, remember, this is originally an oral story that is sung or told by bards. They need places to breathe where they don't get out of breath. Remember, if you're performing a poem for 2 or 3 hours a night, Kardashians or something like that, didn't have TV. This is their entertainment. If somebody's going to be able to do that performance, it has to be set up so they can go long periods. Mnemonic devices. This is stuff to make it easier to remember where you are and the things that you do. Mnemonic devices are often used when people are studying for tests. If you have something that's difficult to remember. It could be something as simple as I before E except after C, how that rhymes and there's a rhythm to it. It's a way that we remember things that are difficult to remember. And naming conventions. This is something we saw in the Iliad, where things are repeated. Gray-eyed Athena. The child of rosy-fingered dawn, that's something that's used in the Odyssey quite a bit. That's repeated in other epic works. It's done here as well. And this is also to help the person who's performing the poem remember that stuff. Okay. At least we can see a word that we have now. It would have been pronounced fired, but it's weird, or the genesis of the word weird. This is essentially relates to the pagan beliefs of the original story, and we even have elements of that the scribe did not get rid of. He has a pagan burial. He's buried in a burial mound with all his worldly possessions. Now, of course, in Christian theology sense, you don't need to take the earthly things with you to get to the afterlife or do well in the afterlife. You need all that stuff buried with you that the ancient Germanic tribes, the Egyptians, and folks like that did. But as I mentioned, there is Christianity inserted into this text, where if something happens that's beneficial to Beowulf, well, it's providence. It's, God's desire rather than God's plural. Because in all likelihood, Beowulf would have considered his primary deity to be Odin, and his brother Thor, Loki the trickster, Freyr, and those other peoples that we get the names of the week for: Sunday, Sun's Day; Monday, Moon's Day. Original word in German, that's the root in English for Tuesday, is Dienstag, which Diener is a Norse deity. Wodan's Tag, Wednesday; Thor's Tag, Thursday; Freyr's Tag, Friday. And then for some reason we have Saturn's Day, which is wife. So we get a little bit more of that Roman stuck in there. Okay. Father-son relations are important in this work, and as we've seen with the hero quest in general, father-son relations are an important part of hero quest tales, whether it's father-son relations between Jesus and God the Father, between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, between Achilles being reminded of his father still in Greece, and the way that he's acting. Gilgamesh doesn't have a father. Relationships, we're seeing this as a repeated motif, going back to that word, over and over again in hero tales, these father-son relationships. Now this reads, Beowulf's fatherlessness appears to have ostracized him from the Geatish court. By serving Hrothgar, he perpetuates past allegiances, honors his late father, to sometimes pause with the German words, and elevates himself to the adopted son and heir of his maternal uncle Hygelac. Through no fault of Hrothgar's sons, Beowulf's deeds displaced them temporarily from their father's legacy, much as Beowulf has been displaced from his own. So father-son relationships can both be physical, but they can be metaphorical as well, because he becomes Hrothgar's adopted son for all the deeds that he does. But who your father was and how powerful or noble your father was means a lot to how you treat the son, which is why Beowulf starts as a bit of an outsider in the Danish court. The fun part, monsters. I have 3 monsters in Beowulf. Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. The dragon's kind of an interesting character. Clearly is the basis of Smaug in not the Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. Tolkien was an Old English scholar. Some of the language, Dwarvish, Elvish, the language of Mordor are all based off of Old English. He was fluent in Old English and could speak it, which must have been very annoying to his colleagues, I imagine. monsters in here, and the superhuman hero who fights against them appear beside other examples of non-human nature from the monstrous races encountered by Alexander the Great, all contained in a manuscript including Beowulf's saints' lives and exotic tales of the Orient. Grendel, Cain's clan, and is identified as an outcast from humanity in specifically biblical terms. Grendel's mother is driven to avenge the death of her son, considered appropriate according to Germanic tribal society, but more common as a person to avenge a son's death. Would it be the mother? It'd be the father. It's a paternalistic society, very much so. So this makes Grendel and his mother even more of an outcast in the society, or unusual, or different, however you want to put it, that his mother is fighting to avenge him. And she ends up being just as strong, if not stronger. Now, if you watch that awful movie that came out about 10 years ago with Angelina Jolie shacking up with Beowulf as Grendel's mother, not good. I did get a paper once that was based on the movie rather than the book, which I found extremely entertaining because it was so wrong. But anyway, so that's the end of the PowerPoint. But some things to keep in mind as I shut down this video moving forward is definitely look at those familial relationships in Beowulf. The importance of family, the importance of clan, the importance of tribe to these folks. And also ancient or not so ancient conflicts. You know, the revenge and, you know, the attacking, get revenge for that attack, then people attack again, is quite important. And also, you know, we have revenge on the part of the monsters. Grendel's mother, the dragon, is taking out the theft of some of his gold on humanity. So revenge plays a big part in these works as well. All right, so let me go ahead and shut down